Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. My name's Alex McCutcheon from Unicom. We're delighted to be hosting the webinar today in association with the Next Generation Testing Conference. Our presenter today is Andy from DB Consulting, Andy Baxter. Andy's a good friend of Unicom. He's a regular presenter at our conferences and workshops, and I think you're really going to enjoy today's webinar. The topic is Agile testing. Just to mention also, if you're interested in webinar and following up, Andy also presents, along with his colleagues, an Agile testing workshop with us, which is taking place next on the 26th of June. The web link for that is unicom.co.uk/Agile testing. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Andy.
Okay, thanks, Alec. Yeah, so my name's Andy. I'm an Agile trainer and coach. I'm also a certified product owner, so I do spend most of my time doing real stuff, working on real projects. So I don't just preach this stuff, I also practice this. So hopefully I'll bring that experience with me today. Okay, so what is Agile testing? I hope you can see that screen that I'm sharing there. So yeah, on the abstract, we put this out there. So we're going to explore today what it means to be Agile, but specifically Agile if you're a tester and what that would mean to you. You're probably used to the traditional software development approach, and you may be finding it difficult adapting this new way of working. So we'll look at Scrum in particular, because I think that's the most popular framework out there, and look at the different testing practices that you can adopt to ensure that you're working effectively in an agile, sort of iterative agile approach. So we're going to cover these topics, broadly speaking. So a brief overview of Agile. Then we'll look at Scrum, overview of Scrum, and in particular, then we'll move on to user stories, because these are the artifacts or the requirements, I suppose you call them, that you'll be working with as a tester, and what it means, what you'll be looking for in a good user story, and what you'd be adding to a user story as a tester. And then we'll look at Agile testing practices, and techniques and principles used by effective Agile teams. Okay, so let's have a look at the brief history then. Well, this chart's showing you here. So we've got this uptake of Waterfall, the Waterfall method back in the 1970s. You'll notice RAD in here. It takes off 1980s to 1990s. People were being a bit frustrated with the Waterfall method. You'll notice that RAD does die off a bit here. Now, someone did ask me, well, why is that? And I did a little bit of research on this, and it seems that RAD it became a bit too process heavy, a bit too specific about the types of documentation that you must produce. So it seemed to have died away a bit there. And then there was this uptake of Agile, and this particular graphic I think is a little bit out of date now. I think that Waterfall is dropped away somewhat, and Agile has become pretty much mainstream. So to recap on Waterfall, where did it come from? So a white paper written by Dr. Winston Royce, American computer scientist. He was the first person to actually describe the Waterfall model, although he didn't actually use the term Waterfall. And in fact, what he did say that this way of working is actually risky and does invite failure. So if you go on to read the white paper, what he's actually describing is something a little bit more akin to the Agile way of working, which is this sort of empirical process where you'll create something and get feedback and then iterate. So it's almost as though that people took the first page of the white paper and said, okay, this is how we should do it. But if you read on, this is actually what he was proposing. So the Agile Manifesto, you may have heard of this. Now this is a group of developers got together back in 2001, and they said we're uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. And through this work we have come to value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan. Now, they do add this. They say that is, while there is value on the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. And I think this is important because it's a bit of a misconception. Or you may hear people say, oh, well, we're Agile, so we don't need to produce documentation. And nobody actually ever said that. That's not what it says here. It says we just value the working software over comprehensive documentation. Doesn't mean to say you don't need to produce documentation. In fact, I think you do. So behind that, the principles of the Agile Manifesto. The highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery. So this idea that we iterate and produce something that the customer can see, they build confidence in what we're doing, can see things that are working. They welcome changing requirements, even late in development, and agile processes and the agile way of working puts you in a good position to switch course quite rapidly with minimum impact to your teams. Deliver working software frequently, a couple of weeks to a couple of months. My recommendation is around about the 2-week. You should aim for a 2-week sprint cycle. The shorter the better. And business people and developers work together daily throughout the project. It's bringing everybody together. And well, this probably applies to every project, never mind if it's agile. Build projects around motivated individuals, give them the environment. Okay, and you need to trust them. So the idea that you're trusting your team to get the job done through that sprint. And face-to-face conversation is the most effective method of communication. So agile teams tend to be co-located, working, sitting together face-to-face. Working software, this is the key one here. So it's the primary measure of progress. So every iteration we're looking to deliver a working piece of software, and we're looking to keep a constant pace. Agile processes promote sustainable development. One of the things I do see is that a lot of management like to drive agile teams and they want to see their velocity increase. And yes, it's nice to see their velocity increase, but what's more important is that the team are able to keep a constant and consistent pace. It gives you that predictability and that ability to plan and forecast. Continuous attention to technical excellence and good design. So you do need your teams to think horizontally. You may have two Scrum teams that are going to touch the same piece of code. And yes, while Agile says it's okay that different teams can all touch whatever part of the code base they need to touch, you do need teams to communicate with each other and think about good design. Simplicity, this is one of my favorite ones. The art of maximizing the amount of work not done is essential. Very difficult to actually achieve. Everybody wants everything. And self-organizing teams. So the best architecture's requirements emerge from self-organizing teams. We're not spoon-feeding anybody anymore in this way of working. We're expecting the teams to self-organize. And at regular intervals the team reflects. So it is an empirical process, Agile, and that's with everything. That's even with the way that you're working. You look at how you're working and adjust and tune your behavior accordingly. So that's the Agile Manifesto and the principles behind it. So the popular methods I've put down, we're going to look at Scrum and extreme programming here. I think Scrum and extreme combined together are quite a powerful Agile way of working. So let's have a look at those. So what do you get with these two ways of working? So Scrum is very much a project management framework, a little bit of governance, maybe a little bit of engineering process, but it doesn't tell you how you should go about implementing. It doesn't tell you what you must follow, what you should do. I think perhaps that was RAD's downfall. It started to tell you exactly what you needed to do, and so people moved away from it. And XP, a little bit different, not so much project management, but more about engineering process. You must pair program, code reviews, all of these things. It's quite prescriptive about the way that you actually do the engineering, test-driven development. So we'll be looking at these two frameworks and ways of working today. So if we have a look at XP, you'll see in here some test-driven development. I'll be talking about that today. Pair programming, coding standards, but there's some overlap with Scrum here. You'll notice that planning poker is used by Scrum teams, but Scrum doesn't specifically say use planning poker. Let's have a look. So, Agile in a nutshell. You'll often see the Darwin image when people are talking about Agile. It's not the strongest that survives, of the species that survives. It's not the most intelligent. It's the ones most adaptable to change. So it's your ability to be able to change course. Work as one team, so evolving requirements, iterative development, time-boxed iterations. You fix the time, vary the scope, as it were. So prioritize functionality. You must be working according to a prioritized backlog. And working software, deliver working software, and then we inspect and adapt. So here we go, some companies that are working like this and benefiting. So what is Scrum? Okay, it is a framework. So Scrum is an iterative incremental framework for developing any product or managing any work. We've actually used this to manage one of our marketing campaigns. It was quite effective. So it's not necessarily limited to software development, although I think that's the most common use for Scrum. Any kind of project can be managed in this way. It gives you, provides that agility, respond to change rapidly, any changing requirements that you have. Scrum, it's constantly challenges its users to focus on improvement, so you have this idea that you have a retrospective at the end of a sprint. And sprints, they provide the stability. When we time box a sprint, it does give, in my experience, great comfort to developers and the Scrum team that they know that there's this regular cadence every 2 weeks, for example. Everyone knows what they're doing, what is expected of them. And these characteristics have led Scrum to become the most popular method. So what does it look like? Well, the sprint in Scrum looks a bit like this. So we start with a product backlog. Product backlog typically contain user stories. We break these down into the sprint backlog, and as testers we're involved with this. Both of these stages, we're involved with building the product backlog and thinking about things in terms of testing. When it comes to breaking these down into the sprint backlog, testing is involved here from day one. Daily Scrum meeting. Every day we have a daily Scrum. It's a stand-up, it's called, where you answer 3 questions. What you worked on yesterday, what you'll work on today, and what your blocking issues are. And then you'll have some potentially shippable product increment. So it's a tested increment, a tested piece of software, potentially shippable. So the roles. Okay, so we've got product owner, Scrum Master, and the Scrum team. So the product owner, responsible for the backlog, managing the return on investment, the vision. They're defining the features. They decide, the product owner decides what goes into that backlog and the order in which items should be delivered. The Scrum Master coaches the Scrum team, removes impediments. Scrum Masters, typically team leaders fall into this type of role, but it's the idea that they're a coach. They could be anybody. They may be technical, they may not be. And the Scrum team is everybody else that you need in the team to deliver that potentially shippable increment. So people that fulfill these roles, typically, okay, product owner, if you can get a customer to be your product owner, then great. Otherwise, yeah, your product owner is having to represent the customers and stakeholders, which is the most typical setup as a product owner. Product managers are suitable for this kind of role. It does overlap with a lot of the work that they would have done, naturally have done before. Marketing, business analysts fall into this role of collecting requirements, building these backlogs, so they're in a good position to be a product owner or a proxy product owner. And Scrum Master, okay, it could be anyone, so it's not an authority role. They facilitate a lot of the Scrum ceremonies and meetings, so a coach, an Agile coach can make a good Scrum Master, but it could be anybody. And the Scrum team is anyone with the required skills. So if you imagine you had to move to a desert island, for example, you need to think that, okay, we need everybody we need in this team to deliver that feature or that piece of software. So when we're actually we're actually working to a backlog, you need to think in terms of having 3 levels of precision. So we start with a backlog item, which could be a user story. When it comes to sprint planning, we then break that down into much more detail. We end up then with a sprint backlog. And then the daily stand-up we talked about, where you have that 15 minutes every day you get together and talk about what you did yesterday and what you'll do today. And this gives you that extra level of detail that you can only really get through conversation during that daily stand-up. So user stories, what are they? Okay, so they're traditionally written on a card. If you imagine a sort of post-it note size card. And they will represent what will be delivered to the user or the stakeholder. They are understandable by the business. The reason why limited to the size of a card is because you don't want too much detail actually in this stage. And they're written like this. So as a user role, I want to achieve something, a goal, and so that the benefit. And the benefit tends to get missed off, and if you can't think of the benefit, then I would question whether you need the user story in the first place. I mean, if you can't identify the benefit, then why is it in the backlog? So an example here is a frequent flyer. I want to rebook a past trip so that I save time booking trips I take often. So I'll put this quote in here, one of my favorite quotes. So it's this idea that it's better to be roughly right at this stage than precisely wrong. So we're going to evolve the requirements. We're going to defer the detail until the last possible moment, when at that point you'll know more. You'll implement. You'll share what it is, your output with the community and get their feedback. So why do we use user stories in this Agile way of working? Well, they encourage verbal communication and deferring the detail, as I said. So Agile is all about face-to-face communication. We want to be talking about these requirements. We don't want to be handing over signed-off documents and just be sitting in a silo working according to those documents that are produced. We want to have that conversation and communication. And they're understandable by all. You can write a user story quite quickly. And it should be understandable by both the business and the Scrum team. So for that reason, they work well with iterative development. You're deferring the detail to the last possible moment. You might not have all of the detail available, so you may need to iterate through this and evolve the requirements. And they can cope with the pace of Agile. You can write user stories very quickly. I can sit down with the client and really quite rapidly capture what it is that they're looking for through these user stories. Then they're quite powerful. So as well as the user story, what we're looking for is acceptance criteria. And I think this is where you really want your testers engaged with this part of the requirements capture, because testers, in my experience, they ask the right questions here. So you'll need to spend some time and add just bullet points is fine to augment the user story. It's things that you know about that user story that need to be captured, that will verify that user story does what we expect it to do. And there are some examples here. So, for example, rather than write a completely separate user story for display the most frequent trips at the top of the list, as the customer or the product owner, if I know that that's how I want it to be displayed, that's part of my acceptance criteria. So you list down here everything that you know needs to pass for me to accept that user story. It's confirmation, if you like, that the user story has been implemented correctly. So when building or writing my user stories, I recommend this INVEST acronym for writing good user stories. So that they need to be independent. So they need to be developed, tested, and potentially delivered on their own. Therefore, they can be independently valued. They must be negotiable, so remember that they're a placeholder for requirements to be discussed. They're not a contract. So they have just the right amount of detail where we can discuss them and negotiate. Now they're valuable. The story must deliver value in its own right. So think of a slice of cake, if you like. Rather than deliver the bottom of the cake first, we're delivering a piece of everything, a slice. And of course, you can estimate them. So they need to be small enough. All the complexity, amount of work required, we need to know what that is, be able to put an estimate against that. And small enough to be completed in one iteration. User stories mustn't span multiple sprints, so we must be able to break those down into to be able to consume them in one iteration. And testable. All stories must be tested before considered done. So they must be testable. So this is a key part for a tester when elaborating on a user story. When the Scrum team is estimating these user stories, we mustn't forget about the testing aspect. So it's fine. You'll come across scenarios where developers will put an estimate on a user story that's quite low, and they may have neglected to consider how difficult it is to test, or might be difficult to test. So testing must be considered and included as part of that estimate. So the common areas of concerns for testers that we come across. Okay, so it's strong focus on developer testing and user testing, not independent testing. So it's a change really in the mindset. So you will be embedded with a Scrum team, and so you'll lose that feeling of independent testing. So, and how to plan for testing with evolving requirements, another concern for testers. I mean, if we're testing sprint to sprint, how can we plan for this? So hopefully we'll come to those slides a bit later and hopefully remove some of these concerns. And when to do testing in short iterations? When does the testing take place? So we'll have a look at that. So let's look at the traditional life cycle, the testing life cycle. So traditionally, things looked a little bit like this. So we have analysis, design, development, and testing. So during the analysis, design, and development part of the project, this is where test planning would typically take place, and test scripts would be generated. Okay, some unit testing during the development phase. System testing, okay, at the end of development. This will all be familiar to you. Integration testing might take place at the end of development. Non-functional requirement testing, and UAT. So that's a very familiar, traditional sort of approach to testing. So requirements used to live as live a separate life, if you like. You could get them mostly up front. The developers would implement them, and they'd be tested somewhat independently to assure that the system worked as intended. Yeah, it all sounds very rosy and everybody was happy, but we know the reality. Things changed. So let's have a look at how Agile testing takes place, the Agile Lifecycle. So there's 3 phases really that you should be concerned with. So there's release planning, sprint planning, and during the sprint. So testing needs to be considered in these 3 phases. So release planning, so story estimation. So we've got these user stories, and as a tester, you must be part of that. You must be considering the testing impacts for each user story. How complex? How will we test it? All these considerations need to take place. You will need to do some test planning and think about some of the more complex user stories later down the line. And it's all about risk. So is it okay to perhaps not do the performance testing in this phase, for example? How risky would that be? So usual risk assessment needs to take place. Sprint planning, so story elaboration. When we're reviewing and discussing the stories during the sprint planning session, then testing needs to be considered at this point. Acceptance criteria. You want your testers to be part of that and sort of drawing out the acceptance criteria for the user story. How will we test it? How are we actually going to decide that this story is done? And then during the sprint, so testing starts from day 1. So we'll look at acceptance, test-driven development and test-driven development, how to achieve that. So here, if we look here, we've got the typical sort of business-facing types of tests, so exploratory testing, UAT, testers. I'd want my testers spending a lot of time with real users here, understanding exactly how they might be using the system. But I also want my testers to be working closely with my developers for the technology-facing testing that needs to happen. So in Agile, it's all about, well, okay, this deployable ring, if you like, it's about trying to stretch that as far as practical. I'm not suggesting that you can at every sprint, the end of every sprint, you can have UAT in there, integration testing, all of your non-functionals at the end of every sprint. The overhead there just might be too costly. I'm working on a project right now where we will have a UAT phase at the very end. We are releasing at the end of every sprint cycle into an alpha environment where people can play around and do some exploratory testing, sprint by sprint. But at the very end of the project, we will have a traditional, if you like, UAT phase. But it's all about trying to draw this circle as far as possible. Need to be practical. So when we're testing in the Agile lifecycle, so when we're elaborating these requirements, I really do want my testers involved with this. I think too often it's neglected when we're elaborating on requirements and we're trying to understand, working with users, finding out exactly what it is they want, that we neglect to understand it, how the testing impact of that requirement. So we want our testers, developers and users working together to understand what that might mean. So dangers of mini waterfall. This is very common. I'm seeing this with a client right now. So yes, you may be sprinting, you may be releasing every 2 weeks something, but what's actually happening inside that sprint is what's called mini waterfall. So it's where we're designing everything in the beginning. We're then developing the software, and at the very end of the sprint, we're then doing the testing. This is essentially a mini waterfall, and we need to move away from that. It's not a good place to be in an Agile team. So Agile, we're short sprints. The testing occurs in parallel with the development, and there are ways to achieve this, such as acceptance test-driven development and test-driven development, which we'll have a look at now, where tests are written actually before we start coding. We sit alongside the developers, write the tests, see them see them fail, and get the developers to make them pass. So let's have a look at that. So test-driven development, it looks like this. So we think it's all about testing very small pieces of code, a small, maybe 5 lines of code. You write enough code to pass the test. So we think small. So we write the test, we see it fail. That's very important. We see the test fail, and then we write the code to make the test pass. We do whatever it takes to make that test pass. And then we'll revisit that code and refactor it, safe in the comfort and the knowledge of knowing that the test, we've seen it pass, and for us to keep it passing gives us that little safety net, if you like. It allows us to refactor. And what's great about this, when you see a team doing this, you'll notice that the team has great confidence in its testing process. They'll see something in the software that needs changing, and they'll change it on the fly. It's safe in the knowledge that we've got good test-driven development taking place. So this test-driven development is typically written by developers. So when you are, I think, in an Agile team, testers do tend to take on much more sort of technical responsibility. They may be writing these, or at least sitting down, pairing up with the developers for the test-driven development. So the tests they're focused, they're isolated, repeatable, quick, and automated. There are free tools available out there that you can have a look at. Next unit mocking frameworks are out there. You'll need to stub out other parts of the system when you're writing these unit tests. They keep technical debt low. It's okay, but beware though, for the test-driven development, these unit tests, they don't ensure the application meets its requirements, and for that we need automated acceptance tests. Let's have a look at that. So acceptance criteria, okay, we define these for each story. So we had a little look at the beginning of the presentation that we'll have a user story, and what I'm looking for when I see a user story in my backlog is its acceptance criteria. There may not be a definitive, exhaustive list of acceptance criteria, so don't treat the acceptance criteria in user story as a test spec. It's most certainly a job for the tester to do during that sprint, is to think about ways to test this particular user story. So we want business owner, the testers and developers to agree on the acceptance criteria for each story. And I really do like having the testers help the business or the product owner and the stakeholders understand what it is that they need to do by defining examples and scenarios. And we need these acceptance tests automated if possible, and to help us drive the development, to give us that safety net that we would have with the test-driven development, the unit tests. So developers using the test-driven development to implement the code, and they'll keep going, just as where they saw the tests were failing to begin with, they'll keep writing code until they see acceptance tests passing. That's the idea here. You need to be pragmatic, of course. So it ends up looking a little bit like this. So we're working with the customer to define our acceptance criteria. We'll create some automated acceptance tests, and at this stage we'll be seeing them all fail. We'll then be writing our unit tests for our test-driven development, seeing those fail, and then we'll start the development, see these tests pass, the unit tests, and therefore the acceptance tests, see those passed, and then we're delivering code to the customer, and round the loop we go. So this is acceptance test-driven development. Exploratory testing. So it's a very agile way of testing. I think this is certainly the most common way when teams are starting out with Agile and they don't have a lot of automation. Exploratory testing is something that as a minimum takes place. But it is wholly dependent on the tester's skills. Not having scripts, they may have some test scripting attached to the user story, some steps that they took to show that the story is done and can be passed, but it's a very manual process. So the Agile testing principles, so it's a whole team approach. So remember that we're all in the Scrum team together, testers, developers, everybody you need to deliver that piece of software. So we're all working together, and when we're elaborating user stories, there's very much the test aspect needs to be there. So the quality is essential to the Agile approach. We fix quality, we fix the time, we'll vary the scope if necessary. It's everybody's responsibility, and it starts from day one. So it starts from release planning and the sprint planning and sprint execution. We're no longer waiting for a milestone that says development has completed and therefore we can start our testing. In an Agile project, that does not happen anymore. And test automation is key, really. If you want your developers to really have the confidence to refactor, improve the quality of the software, then they really need that comfort and to know that if they can run some automated tests whenever they make a change, that really does give them that confidence that they're able to refactor. So test planning, yes, it's still important. You're planning the testing strategy early. We still need to think about what it is we're setting out to test and how we will test it. So we'll need to consider the risks. So is performance important? When should we start performance testing? Should we start performance testing from day one? It's a risk assessment. Plan for the utility testing. So we're not going to leave performance testing until the last minute. I mean, ideally we would have all of our performance testing on non-functional requirements as part of a definition of done and starting from day one. But again, it's about assessing the risks. Can we start performance testing a little bit later in the project when we know more and we've uncovered more? Create test tasks. It's the whole team approach. So during the sprint planning session, the test team must be there. The testing aspect, should I say, the testers must be part of that team and giving their assessment from a testing point of view. We'll keep the documentation light. Remember from the outset, it said, part of the Agile Manifesto, it doesn't say we mustn't create documentation. It just says we value working software over comprehensive documentation. So keep that in mind when you're generating your test documentation. So when planning, before an Agile project, I do like to use these testing quadrants. I find these quite useful, and you can look at these different boxes and fill in and think about, well, what is our strategy here? What is it that we will be doing? What kind of tests will we be creating for this particular project? So at the top of this, you can see the business-facing, automated, and manual testing strategy, functional tests, story test scenarios, for example, and then I'll have a think about, okay, technology facing. What are we going to use? How will we test? Will we use tools? Will we write our own test suite? Those kind of questions will come to mind during my planning phase. Plenty of tools out there. Plenty of unit testing tools, most of them open source. If you're going to do your test-driven development, then you're most likely going to need some form of mocking tools, unit testing tools out there. And I think it's really powerful if you can add to this your acceptance testing or beef up your acceptance testing automation. So there are plenty of tools as well. There's just a few here. I think Selenium is quite popular at the moment out there. Continuous integration. Continuous integration is key. You really want to be able to have that comfort and understanding that when you change something, or it goes straight into your continuous integration environment. It's tested, the build, everything. We make sure that everything builds to start with. The testing is integrated with the build, so when we check in at the end of or as soon as we have a change, we can check that in, have confidence that it's been automatically tested. Project dashboards. A lot of companies I see have sort of traffic light system where if the build fails, and if we make a change that does cause the build to fail, then we can quickly get that fixed as high priority. So the issues when we're transitioning to Agile, a lot of testers, okay, they need to be involved throughout the iteration. This can be. It depends if when we're transitioning to Agile, if we still have separate testing teams, and if what's typical, I do notice is that testers are often loaned to Scrum teams, which is not a great scenario, but it's one way that businesses try and adopt when they're transitioning to Agile. So planning becomes an issue. All the different types of testing that we need to consider when we're transitioning. I cannot emphasize enough though how automated testing really is key for an Agile team. So from experience, okay, so achieving quality is key on Agile projects, of course. So the testing involvement starts on day one. We're no longer we're waiting for the development phase to complete. We're involved from day one. We're setting up. We're writing tests. If we're using test-driven development, we're writing tests before any piece of code has been developed. And therefore, we're keeping technical debt low. Technical debt is a term used in Agile. You'll come across where if we do cut any corners, then we're just to speed up our delivery, or if we're cutting corners on quality, then there's this concept of introducing technical debt that we should pay back later. And testing is for the entire team, not just for the testers. So everybody needs to consider testing in an Agile team. It's no longer something that we can just throw over the fence to the testers at the end of the development phase. It's something that's considered right from day one. When we're estimating the user story, the question, well, how are we going to test this user story, must be answered. So because of this this melting pot, if you like, you have a Scrum team, many different skills. Your testers typically need to have a high level of technical skill. Ideally, you'd be wanting your testers to be able to write some of the unit tests, if possible. Pair programming, use that approach where they're actually sitting with together. Somebody is writing the test before the code is implemented to make that test pass. So automated testing is key. Mentioned that before, can't stress that enough. Constant pace, don't burn out. So we're not looking for teams that are constantly increasing their velocity, although of course that would be a nice side effect. But I'm looking for constant pace. And the goal, think of it like this, bear in mind that the goal of testing is to improve the software. It's not to find every bug. And make sure we're clear about the distinction between testing and validation. So we're not proving, we're not necessarily during our test-driven development proving that it meets the requirements. That validation part is acceptance testing. That comes a bit later, and from the final demo, that face-to-face communication again, where we're inviting the customer in to review what it is that we've implemented, have that empirical process in place where they can guide us and change our direction. And testing is not a phase in Agile, it's central to the development process. Okay,